Welcome everyone to this aquatic plant project webinar, and I'd like to welcome the expert and enthusiast on aquatic plants, Nick Stewart.
Welcome everybody. The aim of this presentation is to gather together um, uh, the bits and pieces about how to spot some of the introduced aquatic plants. You're probably all aware that there are some serious pest species, and it is quite important that people know what they're looking out for, especially if these are spreading to areas that people aren't familiar with them. Um, and Also, I'm hoping that for consultants, it would be quite a useful guide. A lot of consultants that may not be quite so familiar with aquatic plants, but they do need to know what they're looking for, particularly for these pest species, when they're advising on developments. Because if you sort of start having developments where there's a lot of aquatic plants, then they're likely to get spread around quite a lot. So that's the aim of this talk, just to sort of gather together. It's quite a motley crew of species. What I'm planning to cover is ones that are occurring in both Ireland and Britain. The main pest species, and there are a number of native species also that frequently occur outside their natural range because of introductions. And there are a number of rarer species that have persisted. So there will be a mixture of the main pest species, but also some rather benign species. I haven't tried to include it. It's rather open-ended, this that species that only survived for a short time. And there are quite a number of species that for a time occurred in heated water from factory effluent and other places like that. So I'm not going to try and cover those. Those of you that have seen my previous presentations about identifying aquatic plants will know that I tend to split them up into a number of groups, which just helps to narrow down the possibilities. And because it's quite a varied group that we're going to cover here, I thought I would use the same sort of structure for this. So I will go through the various species in the groups that you may be familiar with from my previous presentations. I won't go through the list here. We'll just work through them bit by bit. So I was going to start with the feathery-leaved species. So the leaves in this group are divided into linear segments, and number one on the list is one of the serious pests, which is parrot's feather, Myriophyllum aquaticum. It's sometimes sold in garden centres under different names, Braziliensis prosopinacoides. It's a very invasive thing. It's as in all the milfoils, it has whorls of feathery leaves, and they're divided as in a sort of feather arrangement, a sort of herringbone arrangement, rather than other species which have forked leaves. But it's easily distinguished from the other milfoils because it comes up out of the water. And these emergent stems have glistening glands on the surface. And usually it occurs in quite substantial amounts. There is another one that's on sale. It's been described as a different species. Whether it is a different species is questionable. but for the moment it's called Myriophyllum rubricale, and it differs in being a bit smaller, and it may be less aggressive than the Myriophyllum aquaticum, and it has these red stems, which are whereas the normal parrot's feather has green stems. But otherwise, it's very similar, and I think genetically it's quite similar as well. The As well as those emergent leaves, it will produce submerged leaves, and these are produced before it reaches the surface, and these underwater leaves are disappears as soon as the plant reaches above the surface. These underwater leaves just turn black and decay, and they're quite similar to some of the native native milfoils. The main difference is that they're quite whereas the main similar species are Myriophyllum verticillata, the world milfoil, but that's always green, whereas the Myriophyllum aquaticum usually has these dark stems. And in that way, it's a bit similar to the Myriophyllum spicatum, the spike milfoil, but the leaves are much larger and floppier, and they overlap a lot more. Myriophyllum spicatum tends to be quite well spaced leaves. Also in this group is a plant that's native in a lot of England, which is water violet, but it's and also regarded as native in Northern Ireland. But water violet is also quite widely introduced in other places. So it's worth including here. Like the milfoils, it has leaves divided in a sort of like herringbones, so the pinnate divisions, and but differs from milfoils in having staggered leaves. So that whereas the milfoils have the leaves in whorls, the water violet, sometimes the leaves do appear to be in whorls, sometimes at the tip of the stem, but further down it's clearer that they're staggered on the stem. And of course it has very distinctive white flowers. Although often the garden versions sometimes have more purple colours in the leaves, in the flowers, and is often a giveaway that that particular population is introduced. Another, as I say, this is quite a mixed bag, so there's quite a lot of juxtaposition of completely unrelated things. But there is a stonewort which is thought to be introduced, at least in some places. It was a native. It certainly is a native plant, because there are records going back into the early 1800s in places like Sussex, but elsewhere it seems to be very often introduction, and some of the earliest records are actually from garden centres, and it's probably been spread around with things like water lilies, with people planting water lilies in places. And actually, it's just an aside here. It is well worth having a look when you're next in the garden centres, see what things are actually growing in amongst the water lilies that are on sale, because often there are some quite interesting things, even some quite nice native plants like bladderwort. So it's well worth having a look in garden centres and seeing what you can spot. In Ireland, it's been in the Botanic Gardens at Glasnevin for over 50 years. and it appeared in the late 80s in the Upper Loch Earn system, and since then it has gradually spread out from there. You can see this cluster in the Upper Loch Earn area, and it's now spread into Leitrim and Cavan, and it's now also started to appear in the Shannon. It's quite a feathery looking thing. It has leaves, well, the exact term is branchlets, and in this case the branchlets are furcate, so they're tuning fork type divisions. But it has the distinctive fruiting structures of a stonewort, and the key thing that separates it from the common stonewort, so the common stonewort is the dark stonewort, and you'll see that it's a single cell all the way right to the tip. Whereas in Nitella micronata, the pointed stonewort, you'll see that the tip is actually made up of an extra cell. And sometimes there will actually be another cell division just a little bit back, so there will actually be 3 cells. So if you find one of these sort of Nitellas that have with these extra cells at the tip, then start thinking about the Nitella mucronata. Another rather rare feathery-leaved thing is a thing called the Carolina water shield, or a Carolina fanwort. It's turned up in a couple of places in Britain, and has persisted in the southern thing for quite a substantial amount of time. Superficially, you could easily pass it over as a water crowfoot. It's got the same feathery leaves, which are divided tuning fork like the other water crowfoots. But unlike the water crowfoots, which have staggered leaves, this has leaves in opposite pairs. So that shouldn't be too difficult to separate. It also, if I go back up there, it does produce some rather small floating leaves in with the flowers. This is part of the plant as well. Okay, if we move on to the next group, these are the stringy species which have undivided linear leaves. And the main one in this group is the swamp stonecrop, a very serious pest. Easily fragments and easily spreads, and rapidly can colonize, and probably you're most familiar if you've come across it in this semi-terrestrial form, where it's quite a sort of fleshy thing with little white flowers, but underwater it can look quite stringy, and more elongate, and not quite so recognizable. But the key thing here is that the leaves are in equal and opposite pairs, but which it's a feature it shares with the water starworts. But whereas the leaves are pointed, whereas in the water starworts you will find a little notch at the tip of the leaves. It also tends to be quite a bit more fleshy. It's more sort of solid, substantial thing, quite sort of stiff and fleshy. It can very often it will produce just sort of at the node here. It will produce a sort of a purplish ring, which is another sort of quite useful character. More obvious, I would say, in the terrestrial plants than in these aquatic ones. It is very widespread, it is very invasive, and quite a serious problem. next group are rosette plants. So rosette plants are ones that produce tufts of fairly stiff leaves growing on the substrate. And the most familiar ones will be things like shoreweed and water lobelia. Um, we only have one in this group to think about, and it's some it's a plant. It's the floating water plantain, which is regarded as which is a native plant, certainly in Wales and Lake District. But it has been introduced in a few places elsewhere. But it's not always clear whether it's an introduction or whether it's not. And in Ireland, for example, there's quite a bit of debate. It at the moment tends to be considered as an introduction, um, but there doesn't seem to be any particular reason for it being introduced to where it is, and there it's quite possibly is a native plant, and likewise up in Scotland. Um, some of these populations are thought to be introduced, but some of these ones in Argyllshire, um, the sort of conclusion as to whether they're introduced or not is uncertain, shall we say. The distinctive things about, I mean, it produces floating leaves, so I'll come back to a bit later. But the reason why I've introduced it at this point is that it produces an underwater form, which looks like one of the spiky rosettes. Um, the main character that helps to separate it from other things are these sort of creeping stolons connecting the individual plants. Um, a lot of the Alismataceae, when they're very young, produce rather similar, not quite sort of stiff-leaved, but they're these linear-leaved with tapered points. And for example, is a young common water plantain, Lisma plantago aquatica. It will start off looking like that, and as it gets more mature, it will begin to expand the leaves, and you'll get leaves that are floating on the water surface. So Loranium also produces these leaves, but it also these are connected by stolons, which you don't get in the normal alisma. The only other thing that's similar is there is a variation of Baldelia, or the lesser water plantain, which may be a separate species where it's called, if it is, it's called Baldelia repens. It also produces these creeping stolons, and this has caused quite a lot of confusion. But it's a useful character is that if you crush the Baldelia, it smells quite strongly of coriander, which the floating water plantain Loranium doesn't do. Also, I'm never quite sure where to place this in terms of groups, whether it counts as a rosette plant or a strappy plant. But the water soldier is it's a native in parts of Britain, but it's quite widely introduced elsewhere, and it's quite a serious problem. Because it's quite a bully, and it will outcompete other things. It produces big, substantial rosettes that grow up to about 30 centimeters, and it has these rather stiff, very leaves with rather spiky teeth on the edges. Not quite easy to identify. Um, um, but a serious problem in some places because it can just take over. yes, you can see in the distribution map, it's supposed to be native in this area here, but it's been introduced to a lot of places. And in Ireland, it's in the Erne system, and the Shannon in a few places. I don't know where this is in Northern Ireland, but it's turning up in a few places, and I would say, particularly in the Erne system, it is on the rise. It's becoming more and more common. Um, so moving on to the next group. These are ones with translucent underwater leaves. And mainly in this group, we're dealing with relatives, Eladia and its relatives, the Canadian pondweed, Nuttall's pondweed, are the two that we're most familiar with. Um, uh, and so there are several in these. The most familiar ones that you'll be most familiar with are the Canadian pondweed and Nuttall's pondweed. Um, uh, which are very widespread. The Canadian pondweed has been around since about the 1850s or so, and spread and it became quite a serious pest. Um, uh, and it still causes it's still quite a considerable pest in some places, but it's been taken over by Nuttall's pondweed, which has only been around for maybe 70 years or so, um, and is more aggressive and takes over because it grows taller, and it bullies out the Canadian pondweed. Um, Quite easy to separate between the two. Eladia canadensis has quite blunt leaves, um, and the leaves just arch over, just sort of like like that, very consistently all the way down the stem. So it actually looks quite a neat plant. Um, Whereas the Nuttall's pondweed has a much more pointed leaf. It has much more variation in terms of some leaves that curl right back to the stem, some that just sort of stick out in sort of odd directions, and often at the tip of the stem you'll have some quite soft leaves which just collapse. Um, and I think there's only one sex on both of them, so there's no question of hybridized. I think at some stage there were suggestions that there were hybrids involved, but that's not the case. Um, uh, but sometimes you can get plants that look a little bit untidy and you're not quite sure which, but usually it's quite clear separation between, just based on the shape of the leaf tip, and the sort of curliness of the leaves. There is another Eladia. Oh, I should say that one of the important things that separates Eladia from the other ones in this group of species is that the leaves are in whorls of three. Most of the other ones have different combinations of whorls, and we'll come to that in a moment. There is another species of Eladia which has been established in a few places. Um, it's Eladia calyptricoides. It's rather a rare throwout, and it doesn't seem to persist in most places. As in the other, I don't unfortunately have pictures of it, but as in the other species of Eladia, it has the leaves in whorls of three, and the leaves are quite tapered, as in Eladia natalii. But instead of being sort of curly and undulating, the leaves are flat and straight, and they're longer. They're sort of some of them are over a centimetre long, which is much longer than you would normally get in Eladia natalii. So it is worth keeping an eye out for, but it's as I say, it seems to be quite a rare species, and it's not a case of just being overlooked. I think it is a genuinely rare occurrence. Um, Now, not a common relative in this group is Egeria densa, Brazilian waterweed or large flowered waterweed, which looks like a giant Elodea canadensis. You'll see that it has quite sort of blunt leaves. Um, uh, and it looks like Elodea canadensis on steroids. It has leaves in usually 4 or 5 in a whorl, which immediately separates it from the Elodeas. It's sometimes sold as Elodea densa, but it isn't an Elodea because of the number of leaves in the whorls. Um, and it does produce quite large flowers with obvious white petals. Uh, the normal Elodeas have quite small flowers. So you will find them quite regularly flowering. It produces a long stalk with a little white flower about sort of a millimeter or 2 in diameter, whereas the in Egeria densa the petals are quite a lot bigger. Just for comparison, we have one native member of this group, which is the Hydrilla vertislata. It's an extremely rare species. It's in one place in Britain, and I think it's in 2 lakes in Connemara. And that seems to be it. It was in another lake in the Lake District, but has long since gone from there. It has leaves in 4 or 5, sometimes 6, and they're quite long and tapered, uh, most similar to Elodea natalii from that point of view. But they are much more strongly toothed, quite obviously toothed to the naked eye. And a good confirmatory feature is that if you look right down in the right at the base of the leaf, there are little scales, and you get these scales in I think in all the Elodea relatives. But the ones in Hydrilla have this brown fringe around them. Interestingly, it is considered a pest in many parts of the world, quite a serious pest, but not so in Britain and Ireland. And there are some question marks about whether the genetics are the same, whether it's actually a different species, or but I don't know how far people have got in establishing that. But it does seem to be reacting in a very different way in quite large parts of the world compared to Britain and Ireland. The other species in this group is Lagrosiphon major, the curly waterweed, sometimes sold in garden centres as Elodea crispa. This is actually a problem that a number of quite serious pest species are sold in garden centres under different names. And whether deliberately or not deliberately, to get around the sort of legislation that prevents the sale of these. But this is quite a common plant that I've seen sold in garden centres quite regularly, and it's like an Elodea natalii on steroids. It's a big, robust thing with very curly leaves and quite pointed leaves. But the main difference is that the leaves are staggered up the stem, apart from the size. It's quite a big size plant compared to Elodea natalii. So it will produce these sort of growing points will be about sort of a centimetre or 2 in diameter. But the leaves are staggered on the stem. They're not in whorls at all. So they're sort of dotted. Actually, they're spiral. They sort of work their way up around the stem. Sometimes they can almost look to be in a whirl in some places, but other parts of the stem is usually much clearer. You can see that they're staggered all the way down stem. It is quite a serious pest. Uh, it's in a number of places where it's just taken over the vegetation. We have a few leaves which will come into the strappy category. So the strappy group are ones with ribbon-like leaves, often sort of about a centimetre in width, and are often quite long, sort of 30 centimetres plus in length. And there are a couple of species to consider here. This is quite a rare species, but it is in one or two places in Britain. Um, and it produces these very long, narrow leaves, up to a meter long. They're quite sort of blunt at the tip, but they are toothed at the tip. But in general form, you could probably be confused with submerged burr reeds leaves. The underwater leaves of burr reeds can look quite similar, and the cell, it's got quite a sort of brickwork cell structure, a bit like Sparganium. But Sparganium leaves are always parallel-sided, so you can see that these leaves get wider as you get to the middle of the leaf, and then narrow again at the tip. Whereas Sparganium leaves will be parallel-sided all the way up until you get to the absolute tip. If it's flowering, it produces these are quite long stems. The male flowers detach and sort of float around on the surface, but the female flowers that are on long stalks, and those will start to become twisted. And the species name spiralis because the flower stems curl up into a spiral when it starts fruiting. Quite a rare occurrence. I think it's probably only in sort of established in one canal in southern Britain, but you never know. You'll find this on sale in garden centres, and there's every possibility that they might turn up in other places. Another in this ribbony group is the American pondweed. Now, the American pondweed is a native, or regarded as a native, in the Outer Hebrides, but it somehow has got into some canal systems in the Midlands and in England, and is quite well established there. It differs from other ribbony things that you might come across, like the underwater leaves of Sagittaria, for example, has quite translucent ribbony leaves like this. But unlike these, it has an obvious stem. It's a Potamogeton. It has alternate leaves, staggered leaves, and you'll find at the base of the leaf there's a stipule sort of enclosing the stem. So the typical characters of Potamogeton, but with these rather strange ribbony leaves. And when it gets to the surface, it will produce little floating leaves, a little bit like the bog pondweed in appearance, but often a little smaller, but quite opaque and solid leaves.
So thank you for that, Nick. As this talk has taken a little longer than expected, we're going to finish there for now with thanks to the BSBI and the NPWS. If you'd like to learn about the rest of the introduced aquatic plants, those with large and small floating leaves, you'll need to look for a second part of the video, which you'll be able to find on the YouTube playlist.